All right. Good evening, everyone. This is January 13th, 2022. Coming from Jerusalem, the Narkis St congregation's Bible study on Luke continues on. And this evening, we'll be looking at what does it mean to serve from the perspective of Jesus. And we're going to be in Luke 17. So let's just begin with a prayer. God, we thank you for this evening and that you've brought us all here together at this moment in time. And thank you for your love and your faithfulness to us during all times, the good times and the bad times. And we just ask that you would teach us and help us to grow closer to you and to know you more in all of this. Guide us in your word tonight with your spirit. In your name we ask this, Jesus. Amen. Starting in verse 5. The apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." He replied, "If you have faith as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it will obey you. Suppose one of you has a slave plowing or looking after the sheep. Will he say to the slave when he comes in from the field, 'Come along now and sit down to eat'? Won't he rather say, 'Prepare my supper, get yourself ready and wait on me while I eat and drink? After that, you may eat and drink'? Will he thank the slave because he did what he was told to do? So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, 'We are unworthy slaves. We have only done our duty.'" So we have this analogy or parable, whatever you want to call it here, of a master, an owner who has a slave who's been working in the field, shepherding and plowing, and he comes in from the field and it's time to eat. But his job is not done. He still must prepare the food, and that is part of his job as well. And in the context of the verses before with the mustard seed, if we look at it from the viewpoint of what is a follower of Jesus supposed to be like, what is he or she supposed to do? The first question I think is asked by the mustard seed: what does faith or faithfulness of a disciple look like? And last week, we talked about a few of the characteristics of the mustard seed and the mustard plant, but I think the most significant description of the mustard seed, the mustard plant, is humility instead of pride. And so this is kind of what you could say faith, or I would say more importantly, is faithfulness, not just a belief in something, but an action, a lifestyle that exhibits what you truly believe you do. And that's exactly what Jesus taught as well. And then the second question here is, how does a disciple respond to the Lord's word? And this is what we're looking at tonight in this analogy of the slave. And Jesus, his answer is essentially, the slave is obedient, is not presumptuous, doesn't sit down at the table and assumes that he gets to eat first, but he's humble in his place, and he's obedient to what God has said. And this, I think, could be described as a relationship between the slave and the master, between the slave and the Lord, as a relationship of obedience. So a couple examples that we've looked at in the past weeks of obedience. It's a big theme in the book of Luke. Back in Luke 11, verse 27, Jesus was saying these things. A woman in the crowd called out, "Blessed is the mother who gave you birth and nursed you." And he replied, "Blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and obey it." And your mother is, and your father, is this, very great symbol of intimacy. So your mother is the closest, most intimate person you can come to in how you arrived on this earth. And Jesus is correcting the crowd by saying that the intimacy that the Lord wants is not something that you find in an earthly relationship, but it's ultimately with God, and it's through obeying his word. And in Luke 8, verse 20, your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to see you. So again, his family relationship is being brought up in public. And how does he respond? My mother and brothers are those who hear God's word and put it into practice. So again, obedience is what brings you into the family with Jesus, because those are the people that hear the word of the Lord and they obey it. They put it into practice.
Mhm.
So in our parable or analogy tonight, we have this word doulos, which is the word that is translated in some Bibles as servant and others as slave. And the first thing I'm going to start off with is how should we translate doulos, slave or servant? And we have to remember this is in the first century world. This isn't in England with butlers running around serving lords and ladies, but it's 2,000 years ago, where you have people who are slaves, and maybe bond servant might be a good translation. It's the problem is most people today don't know what a bond servant is, but someone who has sold themselves into slavery, either because of debts or other issues. And there were also many slaves in the Roman world that came from conquered nations or kidnapped, or they were born into slave households. Spartacus is a famous Roman slave with the rebellion that he led. So there were many, many slaves in the Roman Empire. And so slave is definitely, I would say, the best word to use in this translation, to understand that the person that Jesus is talking about in this analogy doesn't have a choice in this relationship. They have either sold themselves or they've been brought into this household, not because ultimately they would have wanted it that way. But remember, it's an analogy. We're not talking about this is how the world is supposed to work. This is an analogy of how the world used to work or was understood to work. And it's an analogy for discipleship that's based on that relationship of a master and a slave. And ultimately, that relationship is based on authority, the authority of the master, the submission of the slave. And there's just you see some examples of this in the Gospels. Luke 7:8. You have that Roman centurion in Capernaum who has a slave who is dying, and he asks Jesus to heal him. And he tells Jesus, you don't need to come, just say the word, and I know that he will be healed. And he explains it like this to Jesus: for because he says, Jesus, you have authority to heal just by speaking. And so the centurion says, because I am a man under authority and I have soldiers under me, I tell this one, go, and he goes. And I tell that one, come, and he comes. And I say to my slave, do this, and he does it. And so this kind of sums up the whole relationship of a master and slave. The master says, do this, and the slave does it. And this is the idea of authority. And it's not just masters and slaves, it's teachers and students, generals and soldiers, and so on. Luke 20, you know the parable of the vineyard. There's a man who plants a vineyard and he leases it out to tenant farmers, and he goes off on a long journey. And when the harvest time comes, he sends a slave to the tenants so that they would give him his money or his portion of the crop. So his slave is being sent out as if he's representing the owner. Luke 14. We did this parable recently of the great banquet. There's a certain man, he's preparing a great banquet and he's inviting many guests. And at the time of the banquet, he sends his slave to invite people. And the whole parable is about, he sends out his slaves to go find people and to bring them in. So the slave is being sent out under the authority of the Lord or the master. In Matthew 25, the famous parable of the talents. And again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his slaves, and he entrusted his wealth to them. To one, he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. And so slaves they're not just under the authority, like they're being kind of pressed down and very subservient. They actually have their own authority as well in certain relationships back then. And they're entrusted with wealth, and we'll see more examples of this later. So another thing I want to talk about in this whole context is the domestic slave, the slave that brings the food and the drink, or what you would call the attendant, the one who is there serving. And in our verses today, suppose one of you has a slave plowing or looking after the sheep. Will he say to the slave when he comes in from the field, come along now and sit down to eat? Won't he rather say, prepare my supper, get yourself ready to serve me while I eat and drink, and after that you may eat and drink? And so this is an example of the slave serving food and drink. And the word here in the Greek to serve is diakoneo, and it's essentially the same word you have in Latin, ministrare, which is where we get our word minister from. And from what I understand, at its core beginning, its meaning is to wait at a table, to offer food and drink to guests. And but it also starts to take on a larger profile of meaning, obviously, because today when we use the word minister, it means like a pastor. It means someone of a certain high authority. And the word deacon, especially if you come from a Baptist church, a deacon has this certain title of authority in it. But at the very beginning of its understanding, a deacon was essentially someone who was to serve tables. You think back to Acts chapter 6, when the apostles are being overwhelmed by the early church that's full of a lot of people and a lot of needs. And especially there's a certain amount of widows. And it says in Acts 6:2 that they're saying they need help in waiting on tables, serving food or drink to, I guess, people in the church. And so this is when you get your first deacons chosen. And we know especially Philip and Stephen, those are your first, they're two of the first group of deacons that are chosen. And they're specifically there to be serving people their needs. But anyways, that's kind of like the core of the beginning of deacon. But it also grows, and it has even a larger meaning as well, as I said, with like officers and people of higher authority. But an example of kind of serving people and their needs, you have in Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats, where I think it's the goats, those where it says, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison? And when did we not serve you whatever you needed? And you see in kind of in all these cases, the hungry person, the thirsty person, the stranger, the person, and we're assuming the stranger probably needs a place to sleep. The person with no clothes needs clothes. The person who's sick, like myself, needs medicine or something, chicken soup. The person in prison needs a letter or all kinds of things. And there's this word here of serving, of giving, of towards people's needs. So in Hebrew, you don't really have a word for deacon in the Hebrew scripture in the Old Testament. You do have a misharet, which is, it's a personal assistant, and it's of the same, it's related. It's someone who's kind of there to help, who's a right-hand man, someone who's present and involved. And so they're serving because of that. So we know the story of Joseph. He goes into Potiphar's house in Egypt, and it says Potiphar trusts him with everything. And that's why, when Potiphar leaves and goes off, just like in all these parables we've seen, Joseph's there, and he's responsible to protect all of Potiphar's possessions, and also even to keep his wife from going off. And Joshua, and then we know Joseph ends up going on to be an assistant to the warden in the prison. And then he also goes on to essentially be the same thing. He's the right-hand man of Pharaoh. So he's very good at this personal assistant thing. Joshua, he's also called the Mesharet of Moses. And quite a few times, he's always there near around Moses, helping him, doing whatever needs to be done. It says Elisha was the same thing for Elijah. He was his assistant. And later on in late biblical Hebrew, like in the story of Esther, the royal officers are called, the Mesharet as well, and to the king. And so it's not just someone holding a person's bag. It starts to grow in kind of authority and power. And, you can become someone in the government and be a Mesharet. And it's the angels are to the Lord, the priest, Aaron, as well. They are serving the Lord. So the slave is also in charge of household affairs, like we've seen with Joseph. And so he's like an administrator. And so you see administer. There's our word there in the Latin, administrator. And in the Greek, he's called eukonomos. And this is from Thayer's. Eukonomos is this administrator or this manager, the manager of a household or of household affairs, especially a steward, superintendent, whether freeborn or, as was usually the case, a freed man or slave. So usually the case, you're dealing with someone who was a slave and then became free because they were so good at what they did. So this is a very common job for a slave, to be an administrator, which makes sense. And so the head of the house entrusts the management of his affairs, the care of his receipts and his expenditures, and the duty of dealing out of the proper portion to every servant and even to the children not yet of age. So this slave is actually more powerful than the children of the family as they're young and they're growing up. And he has quite a lot of power and privilege because he is trusted. And so probably the most famous example in our New Testament is the parable of the shrewd manager in Luke 16, where there's that rich man that Jesus talks about who has a manager accused of wasting his possessions. And he calls him in, give an account of your management because you cannot be my manager any longer. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do? My master is taking away my job. And so it doesn't call him a slave here, but it's very likely he probably was a slave, or at least he used to be a slave. And he, and he says that, well, I can't dig. And so, he's been inside the house. He hasn't been outside working in the fields with the other slaves out there. He's been inside the house. And so the slave could be someone in the Roman world as an administrator, someone with a lot of power within the dynamics of the household. And so this brings me to my last and probably most important point about the slave as a member of the household, which I want to call intimacy. So in Hebrew, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scripture, the word for slave is eved. And a slave it can run from all types of, from the very, very lowest of human existence to it becomes an idiom of intimate relationship. And so if you follow the idea that a slave can be in a personal attendant to a lord or a master and is in close proximity to that master, then they are always with the master. They're there when they wake up in the morning, they're there when they go to sleep at night, and they're involved in their most intimate details. And even when they're having very high-level talks with high-level people across the board, that slave, that specific personal attendant, will be next to that master, taking notes. And so slave becomes this biblical idiom for intimate relationship. And it's used many times of different people, like Abraham. Abraham is a slave of the Lord. Moses is a slave of the Lord. David, who's a king, right? That's quite an irony there, an oxymoron. He is a slave to the Lord. He might be the king of all Israelites, but he's the slave to the Lord. Job, the nation of Israel in Isaiah, is quite well known for being called a slave of the Lord. And again, we often think servant of the Lord, but we're talking about slave here. And I think a really nice example to kind of describe everything that I've been talking about tonight is Eliezer, who's in Genesis. And he's only mentioned once in the story of Abraham, but he's quite significant. And he's mentioned in Genesis 15:2. This is where Abram is trying to have a child. He has no children, he has no son, and he's really old. And he tells God, "O sovereign Lord, what will you give me since I continue to be childless? And my heir is Eliezer of Damascus." And in the Hebrew there, Eliezer's called, he's not called heir as you would normally have in Hebrew. He's called Ben Meshech Beti. Okay. So he is this son, Ben, of his house that he's probably bought through business, however you want to translate Meshech there. But it's interesting that he is of his house. And later on in Genesis 24:2, when Abraham sends his servant off to find a wife for Isaac, it never says who that servant is, but he does say this about his servant: he is the senior one in his household who was in charge of everything he had. Avdo Zakan Beto, Hamoshel Bechol Ashelo. So he is the oldest, the most senior in his house, in his bite, and he's in charge of everything that he has. Sounds familiar, right? And so this is why often interpreters, whether you're ancient Jewish ones up until our modern Protestant ones, understand this servant in Genesis 24 to be Eliezer, based off of, I guess you would say, in 15:2, because he's called, this Ben Meshech Beti. But keep in mind, both of these descriptions of Eliezer, he is a son of the house, and he's the oldest, the most senior, and he's in charge of everything. So I want to read a couple little stories, rabbinic stories tonight to kind of tie all this up together. And the first one is about Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. He's from the 1st century, around after the time of Jesus, but very close. And it says that he went to study Torah before Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now, Yochanan ben Zakkai is the rabbi who was in Jerusalem when the Romans are surrounding the city in 70 CE, AD. And he's the one who sneaks out of the city before it's destroyed by the Romans. And he gets special permission from the Romans to go out to Yavne, which is near Tel Aviv today, and set up the Sanhedrin to continue on Jewish practice. And this is kind of where your rabbinic, it's the birth of the rabbinic school after the fall of the temple, because you no longer have sacrifice, you no longer have the Sadducees. And so Yochanan ben Zakkai is a very important figure when it comes to rabbinic literature. He's very foundational for really the existence of what we have today of rabbinic literature. And so Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa goes to his house, to Zakkai's house, ben Zakkai, and Yochanan ben Zakkai's son gets sick. And so he asks Hanina, pray for mercy on behalf of my son so that he will live. So Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa placed his head between his knees in order to meditate and prayed for mercy upon his behalf, upon the sick son. And Yochanan ben Zakkai's son lives. And so Yochanan ben Zakkai said this about himself. So Yochanan ben Zakkai is talking about himself, and he says, had I stuck my head between my knees throughout the entire day, they would have paid no attention. Okay? So this is one of the most significant rabbis at that time, and he's saying that his prayer does not compare to the prayer of Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. So his wife says to him, is Hanina greater than you? And he replies to her, no, but his prayer is better received than my own, because he is like a slave before the king. And as such, he is able to enter before the king and make various requests at all times. I, on the other hand, am like an official before the king, and I can enter only when invited, and I can make requests only with regard to especially significant matters. So essentially, Yochanan ben Zakkai is saying, yes, I might have this great authority within the local community and within my teaching. And so I am honored and regarded in that way. But Ben Dosa, Hanina ben Dosa, he is like a slave because he has an intimacy with the king. He might not have all the honor and the prestige of an official, but he's always there because he's like that personal attendant who's standing beside the king to go get his lemonade, to go get his fan, to do whatever the king wants. He's always there in his ear. And that's how he compares Ben Dosa there. And that's in the Talmud. So this is interesting, this idea that a slave is a household member. And we see it also in the Gospels in Luke 7 with that story of the centurion, because he calls his slave a child as well. He uses the Greek term there, pes, which you could translate as child or boy. And this was a term often used of a slave who was regarded with some degree of affection, possibly a personal servant. So let me give you one more story from the rabbis. This is from the Mishnah. And this is about another guy named Honi the circle drawer, Ha-Maged. And so it's the winter. The people need the rain to come. Apparently the rain's not falling. And we're going to have rain here probably tonight in Jerusalem. And so the people are asking Honi, the circle drawer, to pray for rain. And so he says, I'll pray, but you need to go out and bring all your clay ovens in that you're going to roast the Paschal lambs in, because the rains are really going to fall. They're going to be torrential. And so he prayed, but no rain fell at all. What did he do? He drew a circle on the ground and he stood inside it. So this is where his name comes from, right? He's the circle drawer. And he says before God, Master of the universe, your children have turned their faces toward me as I am like a member of your household. Ben Bait. I am a member of your household. Therefore, I take an oath by your great name that I will not move from here until you have mercy upon your children and answer their prayers for rain. So rain began to trickle down, but only in small droplets. And so Honi says, I did not ask for this. I asked for rain to fill the cisterns, ditches, and caves with enough water to last the entire year. And then the rain began to fall furiously. And he said, I did not ask for this damaging rain either. I asked for rain of benevolence, rain of blessing, and rain of generosity. And subsequently, the rains fell in their standard manner, but continued unabated, filling the city with water until all of the Jews exited the residential areas of Jerusalem and they went to the Temple Mount due to the rain. And so the people came to Honi, and they said to him, just as you prayed over the rains that they should fall, so too pray that they should stop. And so he prays and the rain stops. And so there's a guy there named Shimon ben Shetach, the Nasi of the Sanhedrin at the time. So he's like the president. He's the chairman of the board of the Sanhedrin. And he says to Honi, the circle drawer, if you weren't Honi, I would have ostracized you. I would have kicked you out. But what can I do to you? Because you nag God and he does your bidding, like a son who nags his father, and his father does his bidding without reprimand. And so again, you have someone who's high up in the religious establishment here. He's the chairman, he's the, whatever you want to call him, the top rabbi. And the people are not going to them for the prayers, they're going to Honi. And Honi and the other guy that we just read his story, Bendosa, Hanina Bendosa, what the two of them have in common, besides that God listens to their prayers, is most scholars consider these guys Hasidim at that time, these type of mystics who miracle workers, and they were on the outer edge of the sages because they were more charismatic and more out there doing stuff, I guess, taking chances. They weren't following all the rules that were laid down by the establishment. But in both these stories, we see that God is responding to their prayers. And in both cases, they're described, one as a slave and the other one as a ben habayit, a son, a member of the household. So there is an article that's come out in the last 4 years in Brill, Journal for the Study of Judaism, and by a local guy, I believe, Isaiah Ben Pazi, on Honi the circle drawer. And he talks about this ben bite, this expression here. What does it really mean? And he's come up with kind of this definition, that the ben bite, the member of the household, has this special relationship between the owner and the ben bite, and it's an emotional closeness and trust. The ben bite is a servant, slave who feels emotionally close to his master, eats from his table, enjoys his protection. The master is good to the ben bite beyond supplying his basic needs and provides for him like one of the family. The master is not embarrassed to be dressed informally in the presence of the ben bite. The ben bite does for the master the regular service of a slave, but is also considered a confidant of the master. It is found that the ben bite has much authority in the household of the owner. So when we go back to Luke, this time in Luke chapter 12, verse 42, it kind of brings more clarity to different things. Verse 42, the Lord answered, who then is the faithful and the wise manager? Which is that word again, that eukonomos, that administrator whom the master puts in charge of his servants or his slaves to give them their food allowance at the proper time. It will be good for that slave, that servant, whom the master finds doing so when he returns. Truly, I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. 12:37, it will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will dress himself to serve and will have them recline at the table and will come and wait on them. And so this is interesting. We have a reversal of expectations, right? Because in our parable today, our analogy today, Jesus says that what do you think? The slave should sit down and the master should serve him. But here in Luke 12, the master is going to be serving the slave at the table. Why? So we all know in Luke 22, Jesus is having his Passover meal. He's in Jerusalem, and an argument rises up among his disciples, and they want to know who's considered to be the greatest. And who knows, maybe they're saying, wow, Jesus is going to die, so we got to find who's going to be his Joshua, who's going to be the person that will continue on his ministry. And Jesus answers them like this: the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? Right? The one who sits at the table is the greatest. That's what we know in this world. And the one who serves is the lesser. But Jesus says, but I am among you as one who serves. So here the master is telling his disciples, or you could call them quote unquote slaves, I'm here to serve and I am the master. And as Matthew's version puts it, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. And so this term, just like we have in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scripture, in the New Testament, the Eved, the doulos, is a term of intimacy with the Lord. And Jesus just told us that he has come to be a slave. He has come to serve. And Paul continues that theme in Philippians 2, in his letter to the Philippians, where he said that Jesus lowered himself to become a slave. And obviously that's alluding back to Isaiah 53's suffering servant, the one who laid their life down to serve, even dying unto death. And then that term, a slave of the Lord, is used by Paul many, many times. Peter uses it in his epistle, James in his epistle, John in the book of Revelation, Jude, Timothy, and so on. So a slave of the Lord it's a very important term, and we often pass over it quickly and don't consider all of the nuances that are found in its meaning. So finally, back to our analogy today. You have a slave that's plowing, a slave or is looking after the sheep, and they come in from the field. And do you say to the slave, come now, sit down and eat? Won't he rather say, prepare my supper, get yourself ready, and wait on me while I eat and drink? And after that, you may eat and drink. Will he thank the slave because he did what he was told to do? So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, we are unworthy slaves. We have only done our duty. And going back to the context here of what does it look like for a disciple to be faithful? You can only be faithful as a disciple if you're humble. You'll only stick to something if you don't think you're too good or you're tired of this all. And a disciple how does a disciple act? How does he or she respond when they hear God's command? They accept and they obey. And so for conclusions, it's this analogy of it's an archaic analogy for today, but it's a powerful analogy if you kind of let it sit inside of you and meditate on it, of a slave and a master relationship that is based on humility. It's an acknowledgement of position and being unworthy, as the slaves say in Luke 17:10, we are unworthy slaves. We have only done our duty. And to be a disciple of Jesus, this is what he's calling for. He's calling for that awareness, that of lowering oneself and realizing how lucky we are to be a slave to the Lord. It's recognizing his authority over us and that we have no right over ourselves, and showing that respect to him for being in that position of being God. And it's also a relationship of intimacy, because when you become a servant, a personal attendant to the Lord, if you're able to enter his throne room and pray on a consistent basis, you gain that relationship as a child, as a son who can run into his father and nag him to answer your prayer, because you grow in relationship. And so it's like family. And also, this relationship is about faithfulness. It's about doing your duty and obeying what God in his word has given us to be our duty. What's our job? What's our calling? And to be faithful, to see it through. And so I think I would sum it up as, God does not ask us to do something that he has not done himself. He walks before us and leads by example. And so there's no need to have any hurt feelings or feeling disrespected. Why me, God? Why me? Why did this happen to me? Once we know our place in our relationship and we realize how lucky and how blessed we are to be in a relationship with a God who will come and serve us, who will wash our feet, who pours out his love on us in so many ways that we don't deserve, then of course we are going to serve him. And it can only come from a place of love because of that. And I want to just close with this nice, quite famous quote from the Mishnah, from Avot. I think that really sums up tonight about faithfulness and obedience. Rabbi Tarfon used to say, "It is not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect it."